According to the Anti-Defamation League, white supremacists killed 18 people in 2017. That's more than half of all extremist killings in the United States last year. One of those killings happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, last August during the Unite the Right rally, when counter-protesters faced off against white nationalists who were demonstrating against the removal of Confederate monuments. 32-year-old Heather Heyer died when James Fields Jr., a man described as a Nazi sympathizer, was accused of ramming his car into a crowd. He's been charged with first-degree murder. While organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks the rise of hate groups, say the far right has been emboldened by President Trump, white power activism in America actually isn't new. It's been around for centuries. According to a new book called Bring the War Home, this modern movement can trace its roots back to the Vietnam War. Author Kathleen Belew is a professor of history at the University of Chicago, and she's in Chicago today. Nice to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you call the book Bring the War Home. Where did that phrase come from?
So Bring the War Home comes from an essay written by a movement leader within the white power groundswell, which is a unification of Klansmen, neo-Nazis, and skinheads from the Vietnam War forward. The Vietnam War represents a profound betrayal of activists in this movement by the U.S. government, and that the response to such betrayal should be to extend the violent activism of warfare on the home front.
I think when you come to look at those modern conversations today, this idea of the government is betraying us, or they want to replace us, right? All those things seem to reflect that same sense about something lost and something being taken away from a far greater force, which rationalizes why they're in this white power movement.
Many social issues that are taken up by white power in the period of my study, including anti-immigration, anti-welfare, anti-abortion, anti-interracial marriage, support of what they call free association, which is sort of segregation under a new language. All of those are understood by white power activists to be at bottom about protecting the future of the white race itself. So there's this idea of racial annihilation and sense of emergency that together create this sense of urgency that foments a real plan for race war.
How come we don't have conversations that talk about people in that movement as terrorists?
So the people that I'm writing about are not lone wolves. They are banded together deeply by social relationships. They are in all regions of the country. They represented people of all educational backgrounds. They included men, women, and children, and people ranging from religious leaders and people with advanced degrees to felons and high school dropouts. It also has to do with a strategy pioneered in 1983 and kind of spread through the movement from then forward called leaderless resistance. The idea is that a small group of people can, without direct orders from movement leadership, can foment violent activism in common cause in a way that cannot later be prosecuted very effectively in court because there's no demonstrable ties to movement leadership. You can think, for instance, of the Oklahoma City bombing, which is the largest deliberate mass casualty in the United States between Pearl Harbor and 9/11. And we still think of that event as sort of the work of one or a few disconnected madmen. But in fact, it was the product of decades of organizing by the white power movement.
Who radicalizes these folks? And what is the role of what I would consider to be old guard, KKK, the David Dukes of the world, in this radicalization?
We have had a spate of reporting on new activism of groups that may or may not later be shown to be part of the white power movement proper, but groups that we think of as alt-right. I think what we have to be aware of is that activists in the present are drawing on a long history of movement organizational strategies and a long repertoire of actions pioneered and tested by people like David Duke in earlier moments.
The book is called Bring the War Home. It's fascinating and riveting, and that archive is truly incredible. Thank you so much, Kathleen Belew, for the book and for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
You bet.